It's my delight and privilege to welcome you to the 2014 Global Strategic Review in Oslo. We are really delighted to bring together the IISS staff, the IISS Council and Trustees, and a strong representation of the Institute's individual and corporate membership together again for this splendid annual event. We are truly grateful to the kingdoms of Norway and Sweden for their support to this Global Strategic Review, and we look forward to continuing that relationship. I want warmly to thank Statoil for their sponsorship and support of this opening dinner, and the Mayor of Oslo, Fabian Stung, for making this splendid place available to us this evening. The IISS Global Strategic Review has developed into an event that engages people from all 5 continents, and I want at the start to pay tribute to the hard work of the IISS staff in all of our international offices who have ensured that the analysis provided at this GSR provides the truly international perspective for which the IISS is famous. The events team and the membership department at the ISS is especially to be thanked for their work in supporting the aims of the directing and research staff in convening this event. One person who would have been immensely proud of these efforts, I should name. Mrs. Patricia Evans. In an association that spanned 4 decades, Patricia Evans, as staff director at the IISS, provided always wise counsel to the Institute's leadership and a guiding hand to young researchers and administrators. She sadly died in August, and I'm sure that everyone here would want to acknowledge the central role she played in creating that sense of an enlarged family with a warm soul that has always characterized the ISS community. Patricia Evans, many thanks from all at the ISS for your service. The international audience for IISS work is made up of 3 constituencies: government and international organizations, strategic analysts and opinion formers, and international business and the private sector. This Global Strategic Review is directed in equal measure to engage all 3 groups. Yesterday, we launched in London Strategic Survey 2014, which we believe helps to define the intellectual framework for what might be styled geopolitical due diligence, the effort to understand and prepare for how political change in any given country or region affects stability and the prospects for successful international engagement either by governments or the private sector. At a time of such dramatic strategic change in so many different parts of the world, international businesses have come to see geopolitical due diligence as a more urgent requirement. It is striking that the Bank of England's Systemic Risk Survey, published in mid-2014, recorded that 57% of the businesses that responded cited geopolitical risk as a principal challenge. In Europe, the Americas, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, strategically significant change is occurring or is in the offing. The regional orders in Europe and in Asia are under challenge, and the regional disorder in the Middle East is further intensifying. All sorts of regional powers are flexing their muscles and testing what appears to be expanding limits to their freedom of maneuver. Geopolitical uncertainty has been increased by a sense that challenges to the status quo can be made successfully and without riposte. Responses over the next several months to the concurrent immediate crises in Europe and the Middle East will potentially have long-term strategic consequences. But moving from crisis management to a long-term strategic approach will be difficult for both local powers and outside forces. Looking ahead, it is clear that the next 12 months will see important strategic adjustment to the regional balances of power throughout the world, but most especially in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. In each region, there are major unanswered strategic questions that need satisfactorily to be resolved before a measure of stability is even possible, let alone secured. Each one of these problems has deep historical roots and is at the core of contemporary power struggles, and each would require intense diplomatic efforts to resolve that are almost impossible to muster given the simultaneity of these crises. This ISS Global Strategic Review is meant to review geopolitical challenges and geoeconomic opportunities. The intellectual menu, containing some 20 courses, is rich and wide-ranging. I look forward to our debates and to the policy suggestions that this conference can inspire. Our task is to understand the events of the moment, but to think strategically. All of us are easily caught up in a process of strategic sports commentary that seeks to provide instant analysis of every global occurrence. That commentary can be vitally useful when it is built on a strong analytical base. And at this GSR, we must all task ourselves to put events into a strategic context and think through the longer-term implications of policies that may be decided on the hoof, but need to be molded into a sustainable effort to ensure local, regional, and international peace, security, and prosperity. And I think that that strategic debate can and should begin tonight. We have two splendid speakers who will be providing a Nordic perspective on European security, both representing the host countries of this joint effort to place the Global Strategic Review and its membership in a position where they can debate openly and from an international perspective the strategic issues of the day. I'll ask first Bård Pedersen, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, to come to the podium, and then Bildt, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden, and then all of us will enjoy a debate and discussion with them over the following 20-25 minutes. So may I first invite, representing our host state this year, Bård Pedersen, to address the Global Strategic Review audience tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to IISS for hosting the Global Strategic Review, an important opportunity to discuss some of the most challenging issues that we are facing today. Ladies and gentlemen, the security landscape is changing, and it's changing fast. The Nordic approach to security is based on our values, our geography, and the fact that the world is moving closer in terms of tremendous opportunities and new dangers. In our southern neighborhood, terrorists of unprecedented brutality are aspiring to statehood. In the East, an established state is applying methods of warfare involving masked militia. The terrorist threat from ISIL in Iraq and Syria and Russia's actions in Ukraine challenge the world order and our common values. We have to ensure that the basic pillars of our security remain intact. The United Nations, NATO, and the conviction that trade, cooperation, and respect for international law lead to prosperity and security. The world may be changing, but we will not change our principles, and we certainly cannot change our geography. Our relations with Russia, with which we share a 196-kilometer border, remain a defining factor. Our NATO membership has compensated for the lack of symmetry between Norway and its bigger neighbor. It provides a predictable framework that allows us to pursue dialogue and cooperation on equal footing. NATO's Article 5 is and will remain the cornerstone of our common security. Today, the alliance is once again called upon to demonstrate its unique ability to adapt to new challenges. Maintaining the Arctic as a region of peace and stability is vital for our security. Constructive relations to Russia have been important in achieving this. Our High North policy illustrates our basic approach to security. A combination of cooperation, trade, and confidence building across borders between parties that respect international law. In the Arctic, we are seeing how adherence to the law of the sea is preventing a race for resources. This provides predictability, responsible management of resources, and thus security. We also have a well-functioning political cooperation in place, not least in the Arctic Council. Having a robust and predictable defense does not prevent cooperation. It enables cooperation. When Russia chooses to challenge the European security architecture, it is vital that allies and partners respond firmly. It is not an option not to react to Russia's breach of international law. Russia cannot escape its responsibilities. Removing flags and insignia from uniforms does not make illegal warfare any more legal. Hybrid warfare represents a challenge that we have to adapt to. International law is vital for the security and prosperity of small and medium-sized powers, but it also benefits the major powers of the world. Let me give you some examples. China's tremendous growth would not have been possible without agreed rules of trade. Russia has joined the WTO in the hope of increasing its prosperity. The law of the sea will secure Russia's right in more than half of the Arctic Ocean, and the Pentagon is advocating that the US joins the convention because it sees that this will benefit American security and prosperity. Some critical voices have claimed that the West is to blame for Russia's actions by acting naively and ignoring both Russia's strategic interests and the paradigm of realism. I strongly disagree. The critics fail to see that Ukraine is not a pawn in a game of chess, but a nation of more than 40 million people that have the right to choose their own future. Furthermore, this criticism is based on an old-fashioned understanding of national interest and an outdated definition of realism. In a globalized world, where the real value of world trade has increased eightfold since 1970, the interdependence of nations is stronger than ever. We still live in a world of competition, but national interests are better served by cooperation than confrontation, and by respecting international law and profiting from a predictable framework for trade. A realist is a person who recognizes his interests and acts accordingly. Given that the world has changed, the criteria for defining and promoting national interests have also changed. The race of Asia show that prosperity and power are not increased by invading your neighbors, but by trading with your neighbors. But the critics, they may have one point. If we want to predict the actions of others, we cannot always assume that all actors have realized that the world has moved on. I firmly believe that Moscow's actions are not in the best interests of the Russian people. Alexei Kudrin, a man who for many years helped foster prosperity in Russia by drawing up sustainable budget has predicted now a 5% slump in the Russian economy. Creating instability in Ukraine and triggering sanctions from its trading partner distracts Russia from handling its real challenges. It is vital that the international community stand by Ukraine. Norway is currently preparing a comprehensive package that includes support to democratic reform and energy efficiency. We will also assist Kiev in its adjustment to EU regulations, as you may know, an exercise that we Norwegians know a few things about. Ukraine faces tremendous challenges, but it must succeed. Sending a strong message to Russia is necessary. Our sanctions are targeted against concrete policies of Moscow, not the Russian people. But it's equally important that we signal that our preference is cooperation, and it's up to Russia to make this possible. You are not a true promoter of cooperation unless you are ready to also defend the rules of cooperation. Bilaterally, we aim to continue vital forms of contact, like between our civil societies and people to people, as well as our cooperation on Coast Guard, resource management, environment, maritime safety, and search and rescue at sea. Globalization and technological progress have brought the nations of the world closer than ever and contributed to the prosperity we enjoy. But it has also brought threats in other parts of the world closer to home. In the Middle East and North Africa, sectarian conflicts are spilling across borders. Citizens of European countries are training to become terrorists. This threat, like all other threats, must be met by a comprehensive set of measures. The measures that we take against ISIL must be political, economic, ideological, humanitarian, and military. Iraq and its neighbors must have a leading role in driving ISIL back. Success in this endeavor requires power sharing in Baghdad and real involvement of moderate Sunnis, as well as a broad and inclusive action from the international community. This will be the message from Foreign Minister Børge Brende at the UN Security Council later tonight. This meeting in New York is a promising sign that the common resolve we need is evolving. The Nordic countries are bound together by kinship, history, values, language, and political systems. Together we have built trust and prosperity over time. As early as 1954, our citizens were allowed to cross borders without passports and to take up jobs in a common Nordic labor market. The defense cooperation is a more recent development and increasingly important. Geography does not prevent Nordic countries from engaging internationally, often in close cooperation with each other. Promoting peace and fighting poverty beyond our own borders is an investment in our own security. Ladies and gentlemen, when our international order is being challenged, the last thing we should do is to abandon it. We defend it. We do not compromise on our fundamental values and interests. We stick to cooperation, to trade, and international law as the foundations for prosperity and security. And we respond to those who break the rules. Thank you for your attention.
Well, it's always a true pleasure to come to Oslo. A year ago, I was able to welcome you to Stockholm, and today we are equally happy to see you here in another glorious Scandinavian capital. And our bilateral relationship with Norway, as was pointed out, is of course a most important and a very close one. There are in the order of 70,000 Swedes, mainly young people, who are working and certainly enjoying life here in Oslo. And in spite of Norway being a staunch member of the Atlantic Alliance, and Sweden in the late 1940s, for reasons primarily having to do with Finland, deciding on another course, the security of our two countries has always been closely bound together. Indeed, it was to a large extent to get control over the flow of iron ore from the huge mines up in the north of Sweden that Hitler in 1940 attacked and occupied Norway, and as a consequence also Denmark, thus de facto setting the security pattern of this part of the world for a long time. And during the decades of the Cold War, the main defense efforts of Norway was concentrated on a very narrow strip of land within the northernmost part of Sweden and the Atlantic Ocean. The solid defense of Sweden was a precondition for a successful defense of Norway. And today, we've entered into a new era also of defense cooperation. Up in the north, the air forces of Norway, of Finland, and Sweden are training together across the borders with an intensity that I think has no rival across the borders of Europe today. With Finland and Sweden and Denmark and Norway, we are charting new ways of cooperation and connectivity also in defense. A lot of our focus, notably from the Swedish side, is on the Baltic region, and that has increasingly been the case during the last few months. But we also, and here Norway tends to be somewhat more in the lead, are focusing on the challenges of the Arctic and what we call the High North. These are trying times, but we do try to engage also Russia in a respectful and mutually beneficial cooperation in this vast new strategic space that is gradually opened up by the process of global warming. When I welcomed you in Stockholm last year, I dwelled primarily on the different new challenges that we, from the European perspective, saw rising in the Middle East. I said that we could face the prospect of a sectarian war raging from Beirut to Basra for years to come, and with consequences far beyond what we could see at that time. And I noted that we Europeans can never just pivot away to Asia, since our fear is that the turmoil in the Middle East will pivot right into our own societies. Our strategic priorities are imposed upon us by the strategic realities of our part of the world. The situation today, a year later, in that region is grim. The horrible war in Syria might even enter its 5th year. And the brave peace efforts between Israel and Palestine by Secretary John Kerry has unfortunately brought nothing so far. In fact, we got a new round of the Gaza war instead. And in Libya, what is there of the elected parliament sits on a Greek ship outside the harbor of Tobruk in the very east of the country. And across Mesopotamia and the Levant, we see the rise of a new terrorist threat in the effort to establish a new Islamic caliphate. Indeed, we see a new belt of terrorist threats emerging in the neighborhood of our neighborhood. Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa, and then ISIL in Syria and the Levant. And today, as was pointed out, the UN Security Council meets in a special session to discuss primarily the challenge of Iraq. Our security reality is being transformed also in the south. When I spoke to you in Stockholm a year ago, I came to Stockholm directly from the discussions in the Livadia Palace on the Crimea and how to bring together as large parts of our continent as possible within the evolving framework of European integration. That had been, indeed, our ambition for a long time. We were engaged at that time in what we called a partnership for modernization with Russia. And we tried to meet the demands of the other countries of the region for a closer relationship with the European Union in order to facilitate also their economic modernization and democratic consolidation. Little did we see that we were about to enter a new period of confrontation, of conflict, and even of war. I vividly remember in those debates down on the Crimea how one of the advisors of the President of Russia in those discussions argued against any agreement whatsoever between Ukraine and the European Union. In his opinion, free trade between Russia and Ukraine was to the immense benefits of both nations, while free trade also between Ukraine and the European Union, it was never an either-or, it was both, would be an unimaginable disaster for everyone. The year since then has, of course, seen the security of Europe transformed, as Russia has twice invaded Ukraine, asserted itself as an openly revisionist power in the east of our Europe, and violated the fundamental principles of peace and security in Europe. With Crimea, Russia executed a smash-and-grab operation of a sort we haven't really seen since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and annexed it under equally debatable historical pretext. The world reacted strongly then, also because to tolerate this being done by one power at one time risks opening up a Pandora's box of also other powers claiming the right to do the same thing somewhere else at another time. And that's why the invasion, the occupation, and the annexation of Crimea is about far more than territorial integrity of Ukraine or the security of Europe. It is fundamentally also about the global order, about the order also of Africa, also of Asia, about avoiding a spreading global disorder. But Crimea was never the real aim. In a way, it was some sort of collateral damage. The aim was and is Ukraine. And the aim is to bring that large European country back into some sort of Kremlin-centric arrangement, whatever we then prefer to call it. But for all the talk about the return of the age of geopolitics, it wasn't only about that, and perhaps not even primarily about that. It wasn't the trade orientation of Ukraine to the European Union that was the number one issue. It was primarily the Ukrainian political orientation towards the European democratic order that was a challenge to the order that the Kremlin wished to see in the areas it claimed some sort of right to dominate. It wasn't the trade preferences of the EU or the might of NATO that installed fear in the Kremlin. It was the flags of the Maidan. Following the intervention, of regular units of the Russian army in the easternmost parts of Ukraine, thus de facto defeating the Ukrainian forces there. We now have a ceasefire that looks like putting us on the path to another so-called frozen conflict in Europe. It will be the fourth such on the direct border of Russia, and it will be the fifth supported and sustained by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. When I spoke to you about a year ago, I certainly did not foresee all of these things happening. In fact, no one did. There were certainly so-called hawks in the debate, uttering warnings about where Russia was heading, but no one, even of them, dared to predict this happening. And where we will be 1 year, or 5 years, or 10 years from now, I don't know. But I know that President Putin has embarked on a course that is new. And I do know that according to the constitutional arrangement that he has put in place, he could well be in power in Russia a decade from now as well. And I do know that much will depend on what will happen in and with Ukraine. To apply sanctions against Russia is one thing, but I would argue that to help Ukraine in different ways is far more important for the eventual outcome. And in particular, to help Ukraine to reform its economy, to get rid of its massive corruption, to end its insane dependence on heavily subsidized gas, and to preserve and strengthen its democratic political system. If this succeeds, Ukraine will survive. The ambitions of today's Kremlin will be blocked, and the fears for the future we today see in large parts of Europe will subside. And then we can also return to constructive discussion of what I call the integration of the different integrations of Europe, and to a true partnership for modernization also with Russia. Both are needed, and both would be beneficial for all. But if it doesn't succeed, we might well be headed for a very complicated European future. It was slightly more than a decade ago that the European Union, in its so far only attempt to formulate its security strategy, proudly said that, and I quote, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free," and that we had entered into, quote again, "a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history," end of quote. That was then. No, today, no one would find those words appropriate. A new sense of being exposed and being vulnerable has descended upon the security debates around Europe, and that, as good as anything, is a starting point for our discussions here in Oslo. Thank you.
I'm inspired to ask a number of different questions, but I'm privileged to sit with both of you at dinner tonight. So what I'd like to do instead is immediately invite anybody in the audience who has a comment or a question to pose to either or both of our speakers to seek the floor by raising their hand high. And when I recognize them, the microphone will, I think, migrate speedily to them. Could I invite comments from the floor? As I say, I can easily ask questions myself, but I think it would be excellent to have contributions. Igor Jurgens, if you could stand up. Igor Jurgens from Russia, member of the ISS Council.
Ministers, thank you very much for very interesting and insightful speeches. My question goes to Bildt. With his international and diplomatic experience. I think that he's a man who can answer the question which bothers me a lot. In any negotiations, and now between Ukraine and Russia, between EU and Russia, between the United States and Russia, there are very intense talks, open and secret, on how to deal with the situation. In any negotiation of that kind, you have sticks and carrots. On the Russian side, it's very personified. If in other contexts you can talk to parliaments, you can talk to the ruling party, you can talk to the prime minister, you can talk to the minister of defense. In Russian case, it's only Vladimir Putin. So sticks and carrots with Vladimir Putin. Question number one. Sticks, I understand. Sanctions, military cooperation with Ukraine, procurement of lethal arms to Ukraine, and all of that stuff. But where are the carrots? What are those carrots? In talking to him who is disenchanted, who is disillusioned, and who lost trust to his ex-G8 partners and Obama and everybody else? Question number one. Question number two, who could be a person who can deliver such message and such message about the carrots? Because it looks like a traditional partner like Merkel or Steinmeier gone for the number of reasons which you know better than I do. Sticks and carrots, and who is the deliverer of the message? Thank you.
Carl, if you want. Go ahead.
Well, Igor, very good questions, and you might be even better or ideally suited to answer them. I'm still uncertain how far Putin wants to go. If you listen to him sometimes, he wants to go very far. He talks about this Novorossiya. He doesn't talk about the east of Ukraine. He talks about the south and the east of Ukraine. And when you listen to some of his advisors, some very key men, I mean, they end up in Odessa with very far-reaching geopolitical ambitions. And they have clearly been preparing that particular scenario. Are there any sticks and carrots that can affect the calculations? There probably are. But I mean, my emphasis, as I indicated, has been to block, in the sense of strengthen Ukraine. And I say that not primarily in military terms. I say it in economic, financial, political, democratic terms. These are all fragile nations. And Ukraine, I would argue, is the most misgoverned of all of the post-Soviet economies and societies. It is a fragile place. But can we strengthen it, its democratic fundamentals, its economy? Then I think the ambitions of those, be that Mr. Putin or be the people around Mr. Putin, who are probing for weakness, and they are probing for weakness. If they see a weak West, they probe and they press. I'm only going to refer to what is in the Telegraph in the UK, but the Telegraph in the UK alleges that there's an EU telegram, and I, of course, know nothing about that, but I read the Telegraph, where Putin had said to, I think it was Poroshenko as well as Barroso said, whatever you do in the EU, I have a blocking minority there, so I can prevent you from doing things. And if that is his perception, then of course he's going to probe further. So it is the cohesion of the West and the strength of Ukrainian society that will sort of block it. And then I think, when that happens, then I think we are in a position to go into a more profound diplomatic deal and perhaps return to what I call the integration of the integration and the partnership for modernization that are so enormously important and needed in Russia as well.
Norway has a strong tradition of conflict resolution, so I wonder whether you have any comments of your own on how whatever sticks are proffered towards Putin, how the carrots might at some stage be introduced.
Yeah, if I may, thank you. I think Firstly, one point. You don't have to go very many years back to find a situation where the GDP of Ukraine was at par with the GDP of Poland per person. Obviously, that have developed very differently due to different choices made. And I think the demonstrators on the Maidan Square were not only demonstrating to look to the EU, they were also demonstrating against a corrupt political system and for need of reform in Ukraine. This happens in a time just a few years after Putin himself have seen demonstrations after his re-elections, and in a time where Russian economy are meeting challenges. This is part of what may have concerned him in my view. Therefore, there are few things that I think is important. First and foremost, that we make sure that we support Ukraine in a way that makes them able to pursue the reform agenda that they have put out. Because in a couple of years' time, we must not be in a situation where Putin can say, look what I said, if you turn to the EU, you will get a worse situation. We have to be in a situation where economic development have been more positive. The sanctions towards Russia are obviously hurting Russia in a time where Russian economy already is struggling, and they discover that it's hard for them to impose sanctions on Europe without being hurt from them themselves. Does it impact President Putin? Probably not in a very short time, but it impacts Russian society and also Russian elites. Just one point on Norway's experience. We signed the delineation agreement with Russia a couple of years or a few years ago. What solved that issue? Well, I think part of the experience is to stand firm on your principles. That process went on for decades, 40 years. To stand firm on your principles, but also to respect the other side, respect the other argument, and then it was possible to resolve this when it was in both countries' interest to actually do that.
Ellen Leipson.
Thank you. Ellen Leipson from the Stinson Center in Washington. We know that one of the positive stories of Europe is sort of that borders don't matter so much, that people can move around and that you can create some political entity that is more porous or more flexible. In the Middle East, we see borders eroding in a way that appears very frightening, where sovereign states are a little bit losing control of their territory. I wonder if either of you have any reflections on the survivability of the integrity of borders, and sort of, does territory still define the political units of our international system, or do we have to be thinking differently?
Carl, do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, Sweden was part of creating the Westphalian system of global governance after the 30 Years' War, more by default than by design. And that is still the basis for the global order. The United Nations is, of course, not the United Nations. It's an organization of sovereign territorial entities called states. That being said, in Europe, we have been trying to establish new models of governance. And Europe was also not only the Westphalian system, but also nation states is one of these European inventions, really. And that dominated the political development of Europe for a couple of centuries. We are now in a phase of development where I think we see that the nation state is not enough. We need the European Union or whatever, higher, but we also see, look at Scotland, we also see pressure on the nation states from below for devolution. People certainly want to get rid of borders and barriers and move freely. We've been doing it in the Nordic world since 50s or something like that, and it is one of the enormous achievements of the European Union, more or less taken for granted by young people. But they question old models of governance, and I think we are moving into a phase of renewed European debate on how this should do, which are the competences on the European level. What is a nation state really got to do? Can we have regional devolution to the Scots or the whatever? people of the Länder in Germany or the Sardinians or whatever. So Europe invented the Westphalian system and is now perhaps the greatest laboratory of the world on developing new methods and models of governance.
Jean-Louis Jagarin, and then I think there's a couple there. If you could raise your hands again so I can locate you. Thank you. Jean-Louis?
Yes, I would like to question the two ministers on something that has really developed in the recent years, which is in the foreign policies of the West, which is the increasingly moralistic priority given in the formulation of our foreign policies, and the fact that realpolitik is less and less the rule of the game. The problem is that when we have to deal with somebody who is purely acting on his perception of a balance of forces, like Vladimir Putin, to have on one side a kind of a moralistic approach, on the other side you have a realpolitik approach, this is not necessarily a recipe for success. And I will take an example. The issue is not who is bad or good, etc. It's the issue we have to solve this problem. It is a negative sum. We are now engaged in Europe in a negative sum game. And we have to stop it. And are we able to do it? I will take an example. There was this escalation in eastern Ukraine with the offensive against Mariupol 2 weeks ago. And rightly, the European Union and the US, but the EU was very active, decided to prepare sanctions. So at this point, there was a compromise, a very smart compromise between Poroshenko and the Russians, and that froze the situation on the ground, and there was a ceasefire. At this point, we could have imagined that, I would say, 25% of the sanctions that were prepared would have been dropped or kept for future use. This did not happen. No flexibility, because the whole mechanics of the bureaucracy, plus the media, etc., was launched full speed. The result is we have now these sanctions. How to negotiate the future de-escalation? Somebody will have to negotiate. Do you believe seriously that it will be in phone calls between Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Hollande, and Mr. Putin that the situation will be solved? How easy will it be for the European Union to bargain on de-escalation of the sanctions? Don't you think that the combination of moralistic approaches and very heavy bureaucratic and totally mediatized processes is preventing real negotiations in the way that at the time of the real Cold War, Kissinger or Brandt or Kohl were able to negotiate, which is no more the case now.
Bård, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you. I think I tried to argue in my introduction that modern realpolitik is not a zero-sum game, but it's opportunities to create win-win situation. I think that is the best way to pursue your own interest, to create cooperation with your partners, thereby increase trade, thereby create growth and security and stability. But of course I recognize that not all see it this way, and we need to understand that not all see it this way. But I think President Putin underestimated Europe's ability to agree on how to deal with this situation. And I think he underestimated the ability to agree between the US and EU. The first step was not sanctions. The first step was to try the diplomatic channels. That was intensified after the downing of the passengers' aircraft, which could have been a situation that created a momentum that would have brought this situation on a different path. It could have shown also how dangerous this situation was. It wasn't. Then these measures, in my view, are necessary to influence on President Putin's policy, but we have to remain, but we also have to send the message that we continue to want the cooperation. And he can always have the opportunity to come back to that.
Carl, on the asymmetry between an overly moralistic approach and an insufficiently realpolitik one?
Well, I mean, first I sort of disagree on some of the facts and on the sanctions. I mean, the latest round of sanctions was imposed not because of Mariupol or something like that, but because Russia had inserted regular units, fairly large numbers of regular units, by the way, directly into the fight in eastern Ukraine. And the demand from the European Union was to withdraw the forces and let Ukraine have control of its border. That's fairly reasonable demands. There is a ceasefire, that's fine. But a ceasefire is not a peace. A ceasefire is a frozen conflict. And the sanctions are part of the leverage that are part of a strategy to perhaps go from a ceasefire to a peace. Whether that will be possible remains to be seen. Then, are we moralistic, overly moralistic in Europe when we talk about values and principles and what happens inside societies? I mean, there's a fairly bitter European experience, very bitter European experience, that has led to the conclusion that there is a correlation between the internal order of a country and its external activities. That has been forgotten several times in European history, and the results have been truly tragic. Does this lead us in to believe that we can change the regimes everywhere? No, it doesn't. But it does lead us into being aware of this particular fact coming out of the historical experience of Europe. And I'm not only talking about Stalin and Hitler and all of that. You could go back to Immanuel Kant and what he wrote about eternal peace, saying the precondition for establishing peace in Europe is that you have what he called republican order in the different countries, some sort of representative government. If we don't have that, he said, at some point in time, you will have external aggression. And I think the last century in Europe demonstrated that he was probably right. And I think it's important that we don't forget that particular lesson.
But taking this debate outside of the pure, wider European context, and given the way in which both of you introduced into your remarks the current situations in the Middle East, would you concede that there was perhaps too much enthusiasm for the promises of democracy in the Middle East through the Arab Spring, and that one's found oneself now in a position engaging in some very hard realpolitik, almost in opposition to the very enthusiastic approaches one took for the promotion of democracy only 2 years before?
Well, I think the most complicated case where we have to go back and see where we're right or where we're wrong is, of course, Egypt, because that is by far the most important of the countries. Where we, should we have been more actively encouraging a transition under the Mubarak period? I would say probably yes. Were we too naive in believing that the Tahrir Square was going to usher into Egypt becoming a Switzerland immediately? We obviously were. Were we too rash in abandoning any hopes of democracy and supporting the coup? We probably were. So we probably need to take a somewhat more long-term perspective on these things and don't shift course as often and as rapidly as we have de facto done, in particular, I would argue, in the case of Egypt.
Gentleman right in the middle of the room, is it Christian Lemire? I can't see. Did you seek the floor? Then Christian first, and then the person right in front of you, and we'll... thank you.
Thank you. Just a question on the Arctic, if possible, in a post-Ukraine environment. Deputy Minister Pedersen, you talked about the political cooperation occurring in the Arctic through the Arctic Council with Russia, which is undeniable. But at the same time, do you not think there's been a breakdown in military-to-military relations amongst the various Arctic states? There's no Chiefs of Defence conference this year. The Arctic Security Forces Roundtable is largely without any Russian involvement at all. At the same time as Russian aircraft are intruding upon Swedish airspace this week, there is a pressure on Nordic countries to increase their defence budgets after 2 decades of declines. So would you not suggest there is a higher level of military competition in the Arctic in a post-Ukraine environment that belies to some extent the political cooperation that occurs? And secondly, if I may, we're about to have a Norwegian Secretary General of NATO. how do you think that will affect NATO's relationship to the Arctic as well?
All right, I think you have to go first on that one.
Thank you. I think the situation with Ukraine and the situation that we have seen in Russia since also before Ukraine, that Russia is on several parameters moving backwards, is creating challenges, and I recognize that there is increased military equipment activity on the Russian side. I don't think necessarily that increased defense spending creates instability. It also creates stability and peace. But my most important point is that this is not related to the Arctic. In the Arctic, we have seen that also Russia pursue their interest within the framework of international law. They put forward their claims in Arctic waters in accordance with the UN law of the seas. And we have been able to cooperate with Russia on issues of mutual interests in the Arctic, also because it's a necessity, also from their perspective. In my view, we should try to keep it that way. Norway has adapted all the sanctions of the EU. We have suspended military cooperations. We have postponed political, done more or less what other countries have done. But I think it is important that we maintain the spirit of cooperation in the Arctic, include also Russia in Arctic Council meetings, and continue cross-border cooperation on Arctic issues. Effect of a Norwegian Secretary General, well, I think obviously from a Norwegian perspective it's positive that Mr. Jens Stoltenberg knows about the High North as well as he do, that he has the experience from dealing with Russia that he does, that he obviously knows the Norwegian perspective very well, but he is the Secretary General of the entire NATO, and I'm sure he will underline that if you... So Norway doesn't have the Secretary General of NATO, but the Secretary General of NATO is now Norwegian.
Carl, did you have anything to add on Arctic cooperation in this context?
No, not very much. Add just on NATO that I think NATO is, of course, a wise organization to go from a Dane to a Norwegian. We expect his successor to be Icelandic, of course.
If not Swedish.
We'll take just two more, and I'll ask them both in a row. So yes, the gentleman whose hand is now up, if you could stand up. Yes. Sorry, there's two gentlemen standing up. So whoever gets the microphone first. There you go, but we won't forget you.
Thank you. Hisham Helia from Brookings in DC and Rusi in London. I just wanted to pick up on the Egypt point that the Foreign Minister raised, because the Egypt file obviously has a very regional dimension. It also has a European one in a very particular way. On the regional level, with the discussions around ISIS or ISIL, the subject of terrorism has turned into a discourse. The war on terror narrative is very much prevalent within the Egyptian context right now, whether it's about Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, but also other groups. At least this is how the discourse is perceived, and I'd appreciate a little bit more deliberation on that point, because we're still trying to engage the Egyptian government on a regional security context, including with regards to ISIS. I'm not sure we're being entirely successful in that regard, but the discussion is still there. And on a European level, what has happened in Egypt has also had a number of effects, particularly within the UK, with the review into the Muslim Brotherhood from the UK government. That also seems to have implications for our European partners, and I appreciate both of you commenting on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And why don't we just take the next question, the final one from the gentleman who stood up before, so I can fulfill my promise to you. It's coming up right behind you.
Malik Dahlan from Institution Courage for Law and Policy.
Hi.
My question is actually related to the soft power strategic dimension of the Scandinavian countries. As you may have, we all noticed the New York Times article that came out 2 weeks ago, somehow exposing or accusing Norway for taking a role in affecting think tank policies across, especially in Washington. I personally think what Norway is doing is great. We need a counter-narrative. The question that I have is whether this is actually really about think tanks in Washington in terms of a counter-narrative, or is it really about the high sea and American grievances or concerns about the Arctic? Thank you.
There are lots of conspiracy theories about that particular article, including authors who were aggrieved. So I think that's quite a complex question to address here. But let me bring it back to both people on the stage on the issue of how to engage with Egypt in these circumstances, and anything else that either of you might want to add to conclude this opening session of the Global Strategic Review. And perhaps I'll start with Carl and then end with you, Carl. Your reaction to what you've heard.
Well, I mean, first, but that's somewhat besides the point. I think that particular article in the New York Times was fairly bizarre. Yeah. But I can disclose from the side of the Swedish government, we even give money to the IISS. If you see it in the New York Times, you've heard it here for the first time. So that's it. Egypt is a very complicated subject, and the efforts that we've done from the European side, EU side, to engage in a dialogue with Egypt about these and other things have, frankly speaking, not been very successful. In trying to encourage Egypt to take a responsible security role in Israel and Gaza, they are obviously very concerned with the situation on the Sinai Peninsula. I think they're even more concerned with the Libya situation at the moment. They're concerned with the flows of refugees out of Eritrea and the Horn of Africa. But when it comes to their domestic situation and Muslim Brotherhood and things like that, still not possible, I would argue, to have a rational debate with them. That must be unlocked, that particular debate, because evidently the evolution of Egypt will be of profound importance to the development of the entire Arab world. We are now rightly concerned with Syria and with Iraq and all of that, but Egypt, with its sort of today, whatever it is, 85, 90 million people, increasing by 1.6 million people every year, the historical cultural center of the Arab world, where that goes, will be of enormous importance for years to come.
On the New York Times article, I noticed that you used the word that they exposed, but how did they do that? Because we told them, because we are open about how we are working with think tanks, of course, and obviously we work with think tanks to bring issues, to get more knowledge about issues important to us and to create attention to issues more important to us. I don't think that article really was about Norway, but that was easy to get information about how we are doing these things or what we are doing, because we respond openly about that. Just one point that I would like to add towards the end. To the questions, did we have too high hopes or too high expectations during the Arab Spring? And maybe. I think we tend to forget a little bit how many years we ourselves has used to develop the democracies that we happen. So we tend to be too impatient sometimes, and that is related to my last point, to the question about us being moralistic. I'm not sure I accept that premise, but I think sometimes we have moved too fast to do what we felt was the right thing and not making sure we did it also in the right way. And that, I think, is important now with ISIL in Iraq, in Syria, that we are able to actually create regional leadership in this situation, that we are able to make sure that the Baghdad government include and involve moderate Sunnis, and that our activity is to support that efforts, and that we not become too impatiently to solve the issue, and then losing the important point of doing it also the right way, which is necessary for the long-term stability in the region.
Ministers, thank you very much for introducing strategic thinking this evening before our dinner. We talked about many things here. One thought that I would leave with you is that a couple of years ago in the IISS Strategic Survey, we wrote the following words, which were a sort of maxim that has continued to be a little bit of debate on the balance between morality and realpolitik. And it was argued in that book then that good governance without democracy is safer strategically than is democracy without good governance. And I think in the debate we've had about Ukraine or the Middle East, those issues have implicitly been raised, as well as the balance between an immediate need to crisis manage while maintaining a long-term strategic vision. So the thought that you've introduced into this debate this evening, I think, will give us an opportunity to work hard over the next weekend. We thank you from the IISS for the support of both your governments to this open and transparent engagement between the private sector, the expert community, and governments in the interest of ensuring better public policy for international peace and security. You both sung for your supper. I think it's now time that you eat it. Thank you very much.